This is a production of WKNO Memphis. Production funding for Behind the Headlines is made possible in part by the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
The continued creation of the new suburban school systems tonight on Behind the Headlines. I'm Eric Barnes, publisher of the Memphis Daily News. Thanks for joining us. We are joined tonight by two new superintendents from two of the new suburban school systems, Dr. Ted Horrell from the Lakeland School System. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And Tammy Mason, superintendent of the Arlington School System. Thanks for being here.
Very happy to be here.
And also, of course, Bill Dries, senior reporter with the Memphis Daily News. I'll start with you, Tammy. So you are how long in the job, and what are your first priorities, and where do you go from here of sort of taking over a school system that sort of exists but that is about to take a whole new shape?
Yeah, well, I'm a little over 4 months. I started January 7th was my first day. We're at a good spot right now. We're looking in the next 2 or 3 weeks of getting possession of the buildings, but probably the biggest advantage that we're at this point is that we've been able to identify the students that we'll have and the number of teachers, and we've been able to offer teacher positions at this time. So I think that's the biggest feat that we've had thus far in the last 4 months.
Right, and we'll come back to a bunch of this, but for you as well, you're how long into the job, and what are your priorities right now as you're at this strange point where you're just about to take over the school system?
Sure, we were on the exact same schedule. We started the same day, just coincidentally, January 7th. We have also offered intent to hire letters to our teachers and notified the classified staff, that they will have positions. So we're really kind of trying to wrap up a lot of the operational things so that when we take over the buildings on June 2nd, that we'll be ready to go and we can quickly assess what needs to be done to get ready to open the doors.
And we've had, from the suburban school system, we had John Aiken on from Collierville, one of the bigger ones. We'll have the others on. You two are both it was scheduling more that we had you together, but also kind of similar communities in the smaller end. Your budget and staff will be, give or take what?
Our budget's a little over $36 million, and we're looking at a student enrollment between 4,800 and 4,900, which is higher than what the initial projection is. Staff, we're looking a little over 400 employees.
Okay, and you, just to give the ground.
Sure, we've got one school, Lakeland Elementary School, so our school system budget is around $7 million.
That's peanuts compared to
exactly. More money, more problems. When I say sometimes we're dealing with a much smaller scale, so there are challenges and advantages there for sure. We'll have about 85 staff total, and we expect to have between 830 and 850 students.
Okay, Bill.
We're so close from your perspective to the opening of schools here. And actually the school systems get started officially, I think, with the July 1 fiscal year. So tell me a little bit about what it's been like over these last few months to create a school system, because this is not the merger in reverse. You all have created school systems from the ground up, a structure that didn't exist before.
Well, I think where we all started at, one of the things that has been very helpful is that we have all worked closely together on this. We meet weekly, and where we started was that first meeting was just identifying all of the areas that we needed to look at and what our options were in building those, whether we were looking at creating those in-house, where we were looking at contracting services, where we were looking at doing something shared. So I think that's where we started. Where we are now is those decisions have been made. We've put price tags with those. We've put it together in a budget, and all of us now are taking those budgets to our board members and to our city governments. And so, but that's probably was the biggest challenge at first, is just looking at and prioritizing what all needed to be done.
Mm-hmm. And you're right when you say starting from scratch, and that there was almost nothing that we could assume would continue to happen without some decision or action or phone call or contract renewal or something. There were no items that would just continue to be. So we spent a lot of time in our meetings saying, have you done this yet? Have you looked into this yet? And it's been so helpful because we all, are helping each other make sure all the things that have to be done are done.
And by the same token, you have to be more than a few steps ahead so that when the school year starts, you're at least kind of already thinking about, is there going to be growth in students next school year? How do you start planning for that? So you're kind of already thinking about the next school year and what kind of growth might come down the way, correct?
Sure, it's a typical part of your yearly process to update your 5-year plan. So we're, and even think beyond that. So we're both having to work with our planner, our shared planner, to kind of make some of those decisions and projections.
And you each got some good news from the Shelby County Commission. You each have some capital funding coming, which you each had needs and have more needs beyond that, I would imagine.
Yes, we were very happy, obviously, to get that. For the last few years, all of the schools in the system CIP budget had been deferred, and so we were very happy and very glad the spirit of cooperation that existed in order for all of the schools to receive those much-needed funds.
And this was the 50 give or take million that went to the county commission,
Right.
and at first it looked like it was all going to go to the Shelby County school systems. Then they did carve out, I think, some $5 million or so for the various suburban. Do you see, how do you see that process working in the future? This was a little bit of a weird year in that you don't quite exist, and there's still just one school system technically, but we all know what's going to happen in a few weeks. In the future, I mean, you look forward to, dread, it's just part of the job, to go to the county commission and say, here's what we need and here's why.
Yeah, I think certainly. I think the next year's will be a little bit different because right now we had to have the spirit of cooperation with Shelby County because all of our schools are currently Shelby County schools. Next year we will be our own system, and so the process will be a little different. We'll be going 7 different school systems instead of the one, so that will be the biggest difference. Don't really dread it. I think it's part of the process and part of the job.
Yeah, and from the other big, there were a lot of question marks as it became clear that the suburban schools were going to break off. The attendance zones and the kids maybe in unincorporated areas, and then kids moving from school to school. Right. Do you feel? I'll start with you. Do you feel like parents are happy, you're happy with the way in which that's going to work, and where with a minimum disruption or more disruption than you wanted, but you had to take it? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, our situation's a little different in that almost all of the students that attend Lakeland Elementary live within the Lakeland municipality. So our school zone essentially is the municipal city limits. We do share an attendance zone with Arlington. We have some students that live in Lakeland that attend Donaldson Elementary and continue to be zoned there. But from our perspective, we have not had a lot of discomfort with that process because it's stayed pretty much the same.
Yeah.
Yeah, and from Arlington's perspective, it has really, I think, opened up parents' choice. They have a choice in where they go. Currently, we have over 700 non-resident students that have applied and have been approved to attend Arlington schools, which do not live in either the Arlington or Lakeland city limits.
Right.
And then additionally, we have over 70 Fayette County students that have enrolled that will be paying tuition to attend our schools.
So out of county, they pay a tuition
That is
fee.
correct.
If you're in county, does the state money follow the child so that the money is covered?
Correct. In county, all of the money, both the state and the local funds, follow the child.
Okay.
Out of county, the state monies follow them, but the local funds do not. So that's where the tuition comes in, is to make up for the local funds.
There was it's kind of an annual tradition, the big headlines about teachers who in the big school system who are, I don't know, what's it called, waitlisted. They're unsure where they're going to go, and there are a couple hundred of them, and there's always a lot of it's so unfair and it's terrible for those teachers. And then there's other people saying, well, no, if we can't afford them, if we don't have classes, we don't want to pay those people. We feel bad for them. How was there any impact for your school systems with the teachers? Did you get the teachers you wanted, et cetera, about hiring?
Yes, I think that process went a lot smoother than anticipated. For Arlington, we were able to offer all teachers that wanted jobs with the exception of 3. There was only 3 that we had to reduce.
3 out of, again, you said before, 50.
We have over 400 employees, about 380 teachers.
Okay, excuse me. Okay.
And we cut one preschool classroom that just had to do with the staffing needs at that level, and then there were 2 assistant positions that were cut as well. So
right. And did you get, without naming names, did you get the teachers you wanted? I mean, do you have that flexibility as administrators? Because that's part of the big debate about that big pool is that the way tenure has changed, a lot of this has changed from the state. It doesn't have anything, it gets muddied up with the merger, but it was unrelated. That now school systems in Tennessee generally have more flexibility in saying, I want the highest performing teacher, I don't have to start with the most senior or most tenured teacher. That can be a very controversial thing, but for you as administrators, would you rather have you want the highest performing teacher regardless of their...
Sure. I think we all would say all of the leaders of school wants the highest performing. This year is a little bit different than I think what the next year's will bring because of the formation of the municipal districts, that we had to make sure that there were laws that were governing the transition, making sure that the rights and privileges of teachers were protected. And so we were very careful as we were crafting our policies to make sure that we were in line with that, but at the same time balancing, making sure that we have the most effective teachers. And so it was a little bit of a balancing act this year, but we're confident that we were able to retain those teachers in Arlington.
Yeah.
Sam, I mean,
We feel great about our staff. I mean, we're really excited at the school level and at the district level about who's coming back.
but in the past, you all were both principals. You were at Germantown
And
High.
Millington, probably.
Yeah, and Millington. There were times in the past, I imagine, and again, we're not naming names, that you were compelled to take a certain teacher that you did not want to have because they were tenured, and you might have had a young rising star type teacher, I hate to say young, but a newer rising star type teacher that you couldn't use?
It was kind of last one in, first one out was the kind of prevailing
and that must have been frustrating
operation at the time. Yes, it was frustrating at times.
Yeah. We used to seniority used to be the gauge, and now it's seniority is with all other things equal. Then you look at seniority. First thing you look as how are they performing in the classroom? How are their kids performing?
Yeah.
As a former principal, that's refreshing that we've gotten to that point.
Yeah. Okay. Bill.
So with your experience in the school system, just in general, how has this been different, and are there things that you have the ability to change once we're kind of out of this initial period of the formation of the school system?
Yeah, I had an interesting conversation recently where I was sitting with somebody that was working on technology in the schools, and she made a suggestion about a way that, it was something fairly mundane about the way we were going to process forms. And she said, well, instead of making these copies, we could just do them online and make them autofill, and they'd send. And I said, well, that sounds like a good idea. And she said, okay. And I said, well, let's do that. She said, all right. And it was just very different because we made a decision for the whole school system, which previously you might have had to take it through committee or take it through a bunch of different steps. And so there's certainly some things you can expedite. And it's kind of exciting to see the way you can hopefully, at the end of the day, make life easier for the teachers and make it easier for them to focus on instruction. That's our goal at the central office.
Yeah, and I would agree. When you're looking at the systems that are on a much smaller scale, that most of the needs are very similar versus what they would be in the county system, and so you have the ability to temper those decisions more directly with what the needs of your small school system is versus having to look at what all the needs are of 100 plus schools.
And that gets to the whole thing, and Bill mentioned this, and we've talked about it before, that it isn't a reverse merger. I mean, it isn't that although we talk about the suburban schools, you all are separate school districts, and I mean, is Arlington, is Lakeland, are they actually better off for having gone through this very tumultuous and frustrating and for a lot of people painful and confusing process over these last few years of forced to merge and then breaking apart? Are your communities better off with even smaller school systems than they were 3 years ago?
I think our community was happy in the Shelby County pre-merger because that was still a fairly smaller system. I think the concern came from increasing that, over doubling that. Better off, I think they're very happy where they are now. I think that they're happy with the local control. You hear that a lot, local control.
Yeah.
I think that this is where ultimately they wanted to be. I don't know if the merger hadn't happened, if we would have gotten here at this point.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of excitement over the opportunities to have the teachers and certainly having more influence, more input over what's happening at the district level. It feels a lot less like, top-down kind of management. There are a lot of cases where I am, and I know Tammy is, where we're going back to the teachers, back to the principals and saying, how do you want to do this? What's the best way? What makes the most sense for you? And even in a system the size of the old Shelby County system, that was just impossible to get total feedback and total buy-in into things, and it is possible now.
Right. In the case of Lakeland and Arlington, the communities, they're both growing communities. And I've heard some of the suburban mayors talk about this, that the school systems will have their own influence on that growth and on the nature of those towns. Is it too early to tell yet how you think that might unfold? What the impact might be on the larger community?
Sure. Maybe too early to tell the scope of the impact. I think we both agree that this will fuel growth in both communities. They're both, have been growing communities recently already. But, we know that housing patterns are driven in large part by education. And we think if we have the best quality schools, which, we think we will, that will drive some of that growth and people will make decisions about where to live based on that.
And Arlington has, I think, in the last couple years have been in the top, this last year, the second fastest growing city in Tennessee, and have been in that spot for the last 2 or 3 years. The property values have increased. When we got the certified tax rolls, Arlington's property taxes had increased. So I think that's certainly the expectation of the city, and in looking and talking with the mayor and the aldermen, I think it's changing the way that they possibly may do business, and looking at the growing, what different businesses will they allow to come into the city that maybe previously they wouldn't, and knowing that those businesses are important to support a school system as well.
Because in the case of Collierville started out pretty early looking at a new school. That's still several years down the road. Bartlett decided to go with a 9th grade academy to deal with some of the problems in their high schools. Do either of you have those kind of problems right out of the gate in terms of bulges in your student population?
Well, we obviously, we depend on Arlington right now. All of our students are going to go to Arlington Middle School and Arlington High School. Arlington Middle School is pretty close to capacity.
Over
So,
capacity
over
at this
capacity.
point, yes.
Okay. So they've guaranteed seats for our students. So we've got an immediate kind of need to address there for both systems to where the middle school student's going to go. So we're engaging in a kind of feasibility and needs assessment study to figure out what's the best plan to address that.
Right. So do you plan for a new middle school in that? You two obviously have to work closely together on
Yes.
that.
At this point, no, and I think Ted and I talk a lot about this, and obviously if Lakeland determines that they will build a new middle school, which we both expect that need is there, then obviously that will relieve the numbers at Arlington Middle School, so there wouldn't be a need to build at school. As high school, I think we're good. Arlington High School is the largest high school physical space in the state. Arlington High School has been up to 2,500 students. Right now we're looking at probably being a little over 2,000. So in Arlington, we do not feel like we have an immediate need to build or add on at this point.
And those cost money. I mean, that's a
Absolutely.
whole part of this that is a fiscal side of it that is new to these communities. I mean,
Yes.
I think Lakeland, had to have a property tax for the first time, and
Right.
everybody. I mean, do you feel the weight of that, the pressure that came with, hey, we're going to have big property tax or big tax increases, be it sales or property, to make this happen? Schools systems get expensive, and there are raises every year. So how do you manage that? How do you manage the expenses and the relationship with the local communities? Because now it's all on them, or mostly, it's very much on them.
Right. I think that it's certainly a partnership. Obviously, none of us have any desire, or do we have a need right now to raise taxes further. I think we've all committed to having balanced budgets, and we are all there, and that's very important, obviously, to our cities and towns. I know, in speaking for Arlington, our city and our city government is very much involved in the process and wanting to support schools, but at the same time, making sure that we're fiscally responsible in the decisions that we make within our budget.
Yeah. Initially the question was, I think, can these communities afford to have their own school systems based on these parameters? They knew we were going to have to, change the local option sales tax and the property tax, and so the question became, can they really do that? And I feel like we're answering the question with a resounding yes. Yes, we can afford to do that. So at that point, the question becomes, we can afford to have the kind of school system that we need. If there's a difference in the school system that we want, that might cost more money, and then what's the desire of the community in terms of supporting that? I think that becomes kind of the longer term question.
And you do get, you know, it's when my first reporting job was a small town in Connecticut, and I covered a lot of school board meetings. And I remember the superintendent sitting there, little school systems, and they'd go through with townspeople in the budget meetings saying, now why is that, you know, why is your bus, you know, number up 40,000? And the superintendent would have to say, well, we have a special needs student, so that's actually a bus, and that would cause this huge spike. And that maybe it's the good. I mean, the citizens of Arlington and Lakeland are real close to you all. I mean, and they may.
Yes.
It isn't like sitting in a budget meeting over the, you know, multi-$100 million Shelby County school system. It isn't even like the smaller school system. It's real close to home, and fluctuations are going to be noticeable.
Right,
so.
and exactly what you described actually happened in Arlington Monday. We had a joint budget meeting between our board and the Board of Mayor Aldermen, and those exact kind of questions came up, want to know why this line item, and you can track it back to a certain student need or transportation. I will tell you the thing that's probably assisted us the most, I think all the districts, is the shared services that we've embarked on. It's something new. No other school systems in the state have embarked on something like this, and so we feel like we're doing groundbreaking work in this area.
For people who don't know, what services will be shared, and how will that work?
We are sharing, and Ted helped me with this, we're nutrition, Power School, which is our student management system, transportation with the use of our supervisor and routers, our IT services,
our business management system, which is Apex, our benefits, if you mentioned that one.
There was some controversy. Germantown wasn't necessarily going to participate. You all have been working real closely together. John Ackerman was on the show, talked about that. Did you just strong-arm Jason Manuel into saying you have to do this? I mean, how did that play out?
Well, I can tell you, Jason has always been on board for doing it. The six of us, when we met in January and February and developed this plan, we all were in agreement that the shared services would be an all-in or an all-out, because it would be very difficult to start picking and choosing, because obviously the number of districts in each of those shared services fiscally impacts the others, because we do it according to students. And so, that just becomes part of each of us working with our boards, us doing our job, and how those services affect us and don't affect us.
Yeah. Bill.
And
that's 5 minutes and show.
That's another point that I think people miss is you in effect deal with two legislative bodies. You deal with one more regularly than another, but you have funding from the county commission, which involves submitting your budget to them as a total. They don't have line item control.
But we actually will submit our budgets to our local funding authorities, is who has to approve those before they go to the state.
Right. So you deal with two political bodies in the process. Actually, as a superintendent, three, including the school board. So there are different tiers here. How do you decide what is an ask of the county and what's an ask of your commission in your case and your board of mayor and aldermen?
Yeah, at this point, we're committed to living with what is required under state law, and so at this point, we don't feel that there's a need to go ask for additional funds above that. Down the future, could it happen? It could, but I think we're all committed to working locally with our city governments in that respect.
Okay. In terms of the start of school that's coming up in August, everybody's going to start school on the same day, at least at the outset here, to retain some consistency. What are you each telling parents about what that's going to look like?
You know, our hope is that when the students come back to Lakeland Elementary School, that things, for the most part, feel the same. Hopefully, they feel a little better. But we're telling them that there's not going to be a lot of crazy changes. I mean, our job is to support the teachers and make sure that we've got great instruction going on in the classroom. So, we hope things are easier in terms of communication and access to information and those things. But for the most part, our core business, we're hoping we just keep trying to get better.
Yeah, and I think that's consistent. That's really been our mantra all along, is making sure that there's as little change as possible to get started, and we want it smooth.
And I would guess the parents have a message for you, and the message that I've heard from a lot of parents is, I hope nothing really significant changes.
Yes.
Beyond what usually changes from school year to school year.
I think there's certainly an understanding there may be some bumps, just as there is with any school year. But I think that they're looking forward to the first day of school.
A quick, just 2 minutes left in the show. something unrelated to the merger, the demerger, is Common Core. Just a quick thought on, I mean, it's been gotten to be a very politicized issue for some people, a very controversial issue. What is your take on Common Core? Are you implementing Common Core? Are you glad to do so?
Yeah, you know, the state has always been the body that determines what in the board, the state board, and what our curriculum will be, what the standards are. We do have control at the local level on how to implement those instructional strategies and things of that nature. Yes, we are implementing Common Core as every other district is in the state, but we do have some flexibility in how that's implemented.
And are you happy with that balance?
You know, I am. I think that higher expectations for students are a good thing. I think that we need to make sure that we continue to monitor and govern that. But I think certainly the expectations for students and them being more involved in the process versus just sitting back and being a sponge absorbing something instead of being engaged in it is a good thing.
And your take on Common Core?
Our board has expressed some concerns about Common Core. They're certainly watching it closely. Like Tammy said, that is the curriculum of the state, so you know we will implement it. And but she also said we kind of depend on our teachers to make sure that instruction's happening appropriately.
And some of those concerns that the board expressed were?
Just some concerns about what they feel like is a loss of local control over education itself. You know, should that be something that's determined at that high level, or should we have more flexibility to make those decisions ourselves?
Right. Okay. Well, thank you for being here. That's all the time we have. Thank you, Bill. Thank you for joining us. Join us again next week. Good night.